I now call the 30th Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lecture officially open.
Will you pray with me, please? O Holy Spirit, the words you have gifted us speak in volumes, written, spoken, communicated, and forming hope and love for all people to gather around. So here, now in this holy place, this place for learning, all of your people ask that you accompany us as we hope to gather wisdom and adapt ourselves anew. Let us be transformed. Let us open our hearts, open our minds, and like a cool drink after a dry spell, be refreshed with what it means to speak and listen. Amen. Please be seated.
On behalf of the National Churchill Museum and Westminster College, I'd like to welcome you to this annual event, the most important in our calendar at the National Churchill Museum. 34 years ago, Martin Gilbert came to our campus, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill, to deliver the first Kemper Lecture here at Westminster. And unfortunately, we lost him earlier this year, as you can see in your program. Last year, we were mourning the loss of our benefactor, Crosby Kemper Jr., and this year, we're mourning the loss of Martin Gilbert. On a happier note, though, we are happy to have our speaker today, and it's my pleasure now to introduce to you the president of Westminster College. If you are an annual attender of this event but don't have a chance to visit the college more often, this may be your last chance to wish our president well, as he is about to retire in June. And we will miss him very much. He's been a steadfast supporter of the National Churchill Museum and all that we do. So it's a bit bittersweet on my part, the first time I've been presiding over a Kemper Lecture, to have to introduce, for the first and only time, Dr. Barney Forsythe.
Thank you, Jim. I retire knowing that the National Churchill Museum and Westminster College are in good hands. Well, good afternoon, members of the Westminster College community and friends of Sir Winston Churchill. On behalf of all of us here at Westminster College and the National Churchill Museum, I want to welcome you to this year's Enid and R. Crosby Kemper Lecture, a rich tradition indeed at our college. I want to express our gratitude to the Crosby Kemper Foundation of Kansas City, Missouri, for providing the grant to make this lecture possible since 1979. Inspired by the famous Iron Curtain speech delivered on our campus by Sir Winston Churchill in 1946, this series builds on that great event in Westminster's history to provide lectures by prominent authorities on British history and Sir Winston Churchill. This grant has brought distinguished speakers to the National Churchill Museum and to our campus, ranging from Churchill's daughter, Lady Mary Soames, and granddaughter, Edwina Sands, to British Lord Roy Jenkins and Sir John Colville, Sir Max Hastings, official biographer Sir Martin Gilbert, and most recently, Sir David Cannadine and Paul Reed. Through these lectures, we see the relevance of Churchill today. Their messages reinforce the leadership and character development model we use at Westminster to educate our students to lead and inspire them to achieve. Today, we are pleased to have R. Crosby Kemper III with us, representing the Kemper family, to introduce our 2015 lecturer. Well known in Kansas City for his civic leadership and as former CEO of UMB Bank and UMB Financial Corporation, Mr. Kemper is also a scholar of Churchill and history, particularly in the field, as I said, of Churchill studies. He is the editor and author of Winston Churchill, Resolution, Defiance, Magnanimity, goodwill, and a member of the Board of Governors of the Association of Churchill Fellows. He is currently Executive Director of the Kansas City Public Library. Please join me in a warm Westminster College welcome and National Churchill Museum welcome to R. Crosby Kemper III. Crosby.
Thank you, Barney. Mr. President, Senior Fellow, Montepay Fellow Fellows, especially the female fellows who in the original Arabic are, I believe, known as Fellows. Ladies and gentlemen, with your indulgence, before I introduce our distinguished lecturer, I'd like to say a few words in addition to those in your program and Jim's words about our first lecturer, Sir Martin Gilbert, my friend Martin. Martin made a distinguished career out of three subjects: the official biography of Winston Churchill, the Holocaust and its relations to modern Jewish history, and the history of war in the 20th century. That this presents a comprehensive vision of the 20th century as well as a vision of an extraordinary independent scholar and public intellectual, or perhaps better said, public moralist, was made evident to me when Martin was last here in 2007. We organized a tour of Missouri that involved 5 speeches as well as a meeting with high school and middle school teachers teaching the Holocaust, which he took over from his ailing wife. He spoke on Churchill in America, Churchill and the Jews, the changing historiography of the Holocaust, and the Battle of the Somme, on which he had just published a book. A progress from the Racquet Club in St. Louis to the Churchill Memorial to the Kansas City Public Library to the National World War I Museum. Each talk was unique, different from any previously published work, and with a moral dimension. Martin was concerned in his epic biography, his histories of World War I and World War II, as well as obviously in the Holocaust and the history of Jewish resistance in World War II and the battle for the Jewish homeland, to see the world from the eyes of the victims and the cost to the victors, even in the most obviously legitimate moral crusades. That he could do this through the eyes of Winston Churchill is sometimes criticized as too hagiographic, or that most obvious of biographers' flaws being captured by your subject. I would argue that with Churchill, he went to the core of the man without ignoring the failures of vision and act, to capture those virtues that lead us all to be here today, the Aristotelian virtues of courage necessary for the warrior and the arts of persuasion necessary for the statesman, and at his best, the master of judgment leading sometimes to the palace of wisdom. One short story. Martin spent time with members of the opposition in Poland in the early 80s when Solidarity was being repressed by President Jaruzelski, and also with the Russian opposition and figures like Nathan Sharansky. He was invited to the White House to brief President Reagan before a visit to Russia. And Reagan was so intrigued that he immediately called the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, while Martin was in his office and said, "Cap, I'm here with Martin Gilbert. He's got to come over and tell you about what he's seen in Russia and in Poland." And he turned to Martin and he said, "You must get over there right now and brief the Secretary of Defense." So Martin exited the White House and had no ride, so he flagged down a cabbie and he said, "You know, this is the moment of validation for any a historian of the contemporary world." I said to the cabbie, "The President wants me to see the Secretary of Defense immediately. Step on it." We all live in both the shadow and in the light of Martin's scholarship and moral vision. Mr. President, Senior Fellow Montepay Fellows, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Toye has written 4 books, 3 of them about Winston Churchill, Lloyd George and Churchill, Churchill's Empire, and recently The Roar of the Lion, and may now be seen as one of the primary interpreters of Churchill's legacy and place in history. That this is complex, paradoxical, and capable of simple ideological or partisan interpretation is well described in Churchill's Empire, where the man who said, "I did not become His Majesty's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire," was in fact left with no alternative but to begin to do exactly that. With regard to the largest part of the empire, India, Churchill has taken great criticism from his time to our time. But using a moment in 1950, an old Harrovian alumni dinner in London, Richard Toye gives us a sense of the personal and paradoxical dimensions, describing a scene that included the once and future Prime Minister of England, Churchill, and the leader of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, whom Churchill had jailed, both celebrating the benefits of a central Victorian, liberal and liberalizing British institution, the English public school. Churchill might have seen Nehru's presence as validating his notions of the civilizing mission of the British Empire. Nehru, of course, might have seen his presence with Churchill as validation of his fight for equality and independence. In The Roar of the Lion, the untold story of Churchill's World War II speeches, Richard Toye helps us understand the many dimensions and indeed the many audiences of speeches that have become known for certain pithy and eloquent phrases, but whose purposes were frequently more practical than inspirational, or with hidden audiences or very specific dilemmas in mind. We know, as John Lucas, a previous lecturer, was perhaps the first to carefully describe, that his speeches in late May 1940 may crucially have had an audience of one or two. His one real rival then and possible successor, Lord Halifax, whom the King preferred, and his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, whom the Tory party preferred. Professor Toye analytically and in detail describes the complex relationship and even more complex needs of the moment in the cabinet, in the Commons, and in the country. And in deep scholarship, with the diaries and letters of ordinary people and the descriptions of wandering sociologists of mass observation, he gives us a sense of the multicolored threads that were woven into the fabric of public response. In looking at the speeches themselves, like Isaiah Berlin, he sees a Churchillian imagination at work in the ability to paint in tones of darkness as well as light, and to give a sense of the tragic dimensions of war and defeat, and indeed even the tragic dimensions of victory. Similarly, an audience of one in America, Franklin Roosevelt, and at other times American radio and newspapers and their readers and listeners, the American Congress, including the isolationists, and of course, the American people. That he got that right should be evident today. Richard Toye grew up in Cambridge, was educated at the universities of Birmingham and Cambridge, has taught at Cambridge, and is today professor of modern history at the University of Exeter. Mr. President, Senior Fellow Montepay Fellows, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of presenting to you one of the leading interpreters of the career of Winston Churchill and the world that made him and the world he made and we still inhabit.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction. And before I begin, I'd like to say what a pleasure and honor it is to be here in these historic surroundings to give this lecture on the, of course, is the very important 50th anniversary year since Churchill's death. It's really a very meaningful experience, having studied Churchill for many years, to be here today. So thank you for inviting me. Now, before Winston Churchill made history, he made news. To a great extent also, the news made him. If it was his own efforts that made him a hero, it was the media that made him a celebrity. And it was the media also that has been, to a great degree, responsible for perpetuating his memory and shaping his reputation, for both good and ill, in the years since his death. Churchill, as we all know, made his name via writing and journalism in the years before 1900, and the money that he earned helped him support his political career later on, at a time when members of Parliament did not yet get salaries. Journalistic activities were also important to him later in his career, as he struggled in the interwar years to find the money to run and maintain Chartwell, his house in Kent. Not only then was journalism an important aspect of his political persona, but he himself was a news obsessive. Clementine Churchill once related the story of her honeymoon in Venice. I quote, "It was all new to her, and as they walked down some famous street of palaces, she looked about her with wonder and delight. Suddenly, she missed Winston. He had dived into a newspaper shop and presently emerged with a bundle of copies of the Times under his arm. He sat down on a stone and buried his head in the paper, oblivious to all the beauties of Venice." Now, the story of Churchill and the news is filled with colourful characters. It's a tale of rapidly changing technology, tight deadlines, off-the-record briefings and smoke-filled newsrooms, and of wartime summits which were turned into stage-managed global media events. Yet, in spite of the rapid improvements in communications during the course of Churchill's life, the ways in which the media covered his career were powerfully influenced not only by what was technically possible, but what I shall call today news culture. And what do I mean by news culture? Well, we can see, for example, that British and American newspapers shared very similar technology across the period, and yet were in many ways very different kinds of production, their contents, their style, the way that they were written. So that's what I'm trying to get at when I talk about news culture. Furthermore, Churchill was not merely the passive subject of British and global news culture, but he did a great deal to help shape that culture himself, not least through his own prolific journalism and through his attempts to influence editors and reporters. Now, the story of Churchill's engagement with journalism and the media has never been told in the systematic way that it deserves. Of course, the many works that have been written about Churchill have all, to a greater or lesser extent, touched on this issue. Of course, biographies naturally refer to his journalistic exploits, and there are other parts of the story that have certainly received attention too. But I would argue that sustained analysis of this theme over the whole period of Churchill's life has been lacking. So today, I really want to do two things. Firstly, to show how the development of Churchill's public life was influenced by the demands of the media, and how press, film, and radio contributed to his political successes and failures. Secondly, I want to examine what the contemporary reporting of Churchill's life, including the reporting about his life that he did himself, can tell us about the development of news culture from the Victorian era through to the space age. Now, as you may have guessed, the title of my lecture is inspired to a degree by Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, The Bully Pulpit, Theodore Roosevelt and the Golden Age of Journalism. But my approach, however, is a little bit different from hers. Although Goodwin paints a fascinating portrait of progressive era news culture and its relationship with politics, she doesn't really question the degree to which that period really was a golden age, or indeed she doesn't really ask what a golden age of journalism would really constitute. So I'm going to begin by examining the news culture into which Churchill was born, and then look at a number of his journalistic forays before considering three themes that cast light on his career-long engagement with the media. I will conclude by suggesting that although in some ways the period can look golden, there is another way of looking at the problem of Churchill and the news. When we consider how politics became obsessed with image and how awkward stories were kept from the public, his story perhaps has much to tell us about the origins of the arguably highly problematic media culture that we live with today. Now, to start with the Victorian era and the birth of global news culture. The arrival of Winston Churchill into the world at Blenheim Palace in 1874 made the front page of the Times, but not as a news item. Rather, it features as a paid announcement in the births column, which shared the front page not only with reports of deaths and marriages, but also advertisements for goods and services, concerts and events, and even enigmatic personal messages. The news was in the inside of the paper, and news didn't appear on the Times front page, in fact, until 1966, although an exception had been made for Churchill's death the year before. Yet other British papers had been providing eye-catching banner headlines of the kind that we're now familiar with for decades, so the Times' decision to maintain its old-fashioned look for so long really represented a conscious effort on the part of its editors to distinguish the Times from its vulgar competitor titles. Now, this point raises an important issue about news culture during Churchill's lifetime and beyond. Technology influenced the media, of course, but it did not entirely determine its contents. Other factors, including government attitudes and policies, market conditions, and the preferences and idiosyncrasies of proprietors were important too. Nevertheless, when we ask what the media was like during the period of Churchill's early life, it is important to understand that the press was in the throes of an ongoing revolution. The production of news was becoming increasingly globalized. The telegraph was invented in 1833, and 11 years later, the nomination of Henry Clay for US president became the first news to be transmitted by telegraph. The first transatlantic cable was laid in 1858, and although it quickly failed, another came into operation in 1866. And the telegraph was crucial to the success of the new international news agencies, the first of which was launched in 1835. Globalization was an uneven process, though, and London emerged as a global news center, in particular providing American news to Europe. By 1900, Britain owned 72% of the world's submarine cable, And in 1902, the so-called all-red cable route, linking the territories of the British Empire by telegraph was completed. Churchill himself was an inveterate sender of telegrams, both in his personal life and in his journalistic career. It was quick and it was efficient, but it could be expensive. When Churchill was reporting from South Africa at the time of the Boer War, every telegram sent from the Cape to Britain cost at least 18 pence per word, and sometimes even 6 or even 12 shillings per word if sent at the so-called urgency rate. So a normal newspaper column would cost, if you only counted the cost of the telegram at the lowest rate, about £185. And one of Churchill's telegrams was said to have cost £350. And when we translate this into modern figures, it's an extraordinary sum, approximately £37,500 or $58,000 for a single telegram. Now, and really what that tells us, I think, is that although the speeds of communication were in some ways almost as quick as they are today, at least between some parts of the world, the relative cost of that communication was enormously higher. Now, it might be tempting to reduce all this story to a simple equation. Telegraph plus news agencies equals globalization of news. However, it was more complicated than that. As Churchill, who, as we all know, was fascinated by technology, would have been well aware there were many other innovations that contributed to the news revolution to which I've referred. One thinks most obviously of the telephone, invented in 1877, and the development of wireless telegraphy or radio at the turn of the 20th century. By the time that Churchill became Prime Minister, and indeed well before, news could travel around the globe at speeds that do, as I said a moment ago, bear comparison at least with today. Globalization led to a degree of homogenization in terms of news content. As the news historian Bob Nicholson has observed, there was a culture of transatlantic reprinting. During the final quarter of the 19th century, miscellaneous snippets cut from the pages of the American press became a staple feature of Britain's best-selling newspapers and magazines. And indeed, during the Boer War, papers in Britain and around the world simply reprinted Churchill's articles and telegrams to his employer, the Morning Post, apparently without having asked permission in many cases, and without showing any concern for copyright, nor any sense of embarrassment that they were simply reproducing another paper's material. And in a rather different way, Churchill himself participated actively in what we might call this culture of recycling. His articles often formed the basis for his books, and others of his books were serialized in the press as articles. And even during World War II, the Sunday Dispatch republished his old articles week by week, so that we think, of course, of Churchill being as Prime Minister during World War II, but he was also being represented to a part of the public through his own writings, which were again being reproduced in the press. Nevertheless, this homogenization brought about by globalization certainly didn't eliminate diversity. During the period when Churchill came of age, there was still a very strong local and regional press. And these papers used to be politically partisan and proud of it. And so Churchill fought his first election campaign at Oldham in 1899, and there were two local papers. The fiercely Tory Oldham Daily Standard published fulsome accounts of Churchill's meetings, whereas the staunchly liberal Oldham Evening Chronicle ridiculed him as a tyro. It said, "He has scampered across the Sudan with the Kitchener campaign and returned with a consuming desire to enter Parliament. This experience might have qualified him as a member for the Nile division of the Sudan, but it is hardly a reason why you should come and ask Oldham electors to make a member of Parliament of him." Now, in many ways, Churchill had the perfect credentials for politics in this new journalistic age. The rise of a cheap mass press had been made possible not only by improvements in technology, but by the end of the last of the so-called taxes on knowledge, such as stamp duties and paper duties, that had been repealed not long before Churchill's birth. The so-called new journalism of the 1880s and 90s was brash, populist, and exciting. As Jonathan Rose has noted, Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, had been among the first politicians to exploit personality-driven journalism successfully. A few months after his fall from office, Lord Randolph made a highly publicised journey to South Africa, and the Daily Graphic paid him again the astonishing sum of 2,000 guineas for 20 letters reporting on his exploits. And Lord Randolph's controversial pronouncements generated much press coverage at home, which his teenage son Winston eagerly read. Now, Winston later followed in his father's footsteps directly in that he too wrote for the Graphic, reporting for it on his adventures in Cuba in 1895. Over the next few years, he wrote variously for the Indian Pioneer Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and, as I already mentioned, the Morning Post. Yet, although he didn't at this stage write for it himself, it was the Daily Mail that arguably best matched Churchill's style of public conduct. Founded by Alfred Harmsworth, later Lord Northcliffe, in 1896, the Mail was famously dismissed by Lord Salisbury as being written by office boys for office boys. In 1898, the Mail's celebrated reporter G.W. Stevens, who Churchill described as the most brilliant man in journalism I have ever met, boosted his new friend's career with an article that dubbed Churchill the youngest man in Europe. Stevens shrewdly observed that Churchill had qualities that could make him almost at will a great popular leader, a great journalist, or the founder of a great advertising business. At this time, Churchill's politics fitted with those of the Mail very closely. He was imperialistic and staunchly conservative. During his 20-year Liberal phase, though, he was a member of a party that the Mail essentially despised, although this did not prevent the paper from depicting Churchill as the star of the 1906 general election campaign. The paper was delighted by the fact that he not only gave martial arts demonstrations, but also wore interesting hats. Now, Churchill has been described as the quintessential sensation seeker, and the Daily Mail was the quintessential sensation-seeking paper. Churchill was happy to seek out the type of publicity that it and its rivals offered, and this was one factor leading some other more staid and conventional politicians to treat Churchill with considerable distrust. Churchill undoubtedly did establish himself as a great journalist, as Stevens had predicted, at the same time that he was working to establish himself as a political leader. In his first ministerial job, as a junior minister at the Colonial Office, he wrote up a major tour of Africa as a series of articles for Strand magazine, which were then published in book form as My African Journey in 1908. Reviewing it, the Observer commented, "If there was such a thing as the public journalist of the empire, there could only be one nomination. Mr. Churchill would be chosen with unanimity." Without doubt, his skills were politically useful not only to himself but to his colleagues. In 1916, during the period when he was out of office, he was commissioned by the government to write a press statement on the Battle of Jutland after the official account issued by the Admiralty had caused public disquiet. After he returned to government in 1917 as Minister of Munitions, he put Alexander McCallum Scott, a Liberal MP who was also Churchill's own first biographer, in charge of the department's publicity efforts, and there flowed afterwards a great volume of publicity, published material on behalf of the ministry. As a cabinet minister in Lloyd George's post-war coalition, Churchill continued to write press articles. For instance, his 1920 illustrated Sunday Herald piece on the Jewish question, which proved very controversial, in part because he suggested that some Jews were responsible for the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, it was doubtless partly because he wanted to avoid this type of controversy that Stanley Baldwin, as Conservative Prime Minister during the 1920s, actively discouraged his ministers from publishing press articles. Although I would emphasise there's no evidence that Baldwin was specifically concerned about Churchill or that he was specifically concerned about any particular article that Churchill had written. Nevertheless, when Churchill was Baldwin's Chancellor of the Exchequer in the later 1920s, he managed to sidestep the rule about not publishing press articles, at least to the extent that parts of his book, The World Crisis, were serialised in the Times. During Churchill's wilderness years in the 1930s, his journalism again became prolific. This was partly a matter of money, made necessary by his extravagant personal habits and by the financial damage that he had suffered as a result of the Wall Street crash. Sometimes, it must be said, he did resort to hack work, although he does seem to have drawn the line at the proposal that was made to him that he should write a series called Great Bible Stories Retold. In 1932, though, he received £2,000 for 6 News of the World articles summarising the plots of well-known novels, with a further £1,800 for syndication in the Chicago Tribune. As these pieces were actually written by Churchill's friend Eddie Marsh for £25 each, you can see that he was making quite a good profit. Yet Churchill didn't simply treat the press as a cash cow. It offered him a means to put his views on rearmament and appeasement before the public at a time when, for the most part, the BBC was keeping him off the airwaves. After World War II, his fame was such that during his time as leader of the opposition, from 1945 to 51, he no longer faced any struggle to get his voice heard. Nevertheless, newspaper articles continued to provide him with an occasional outlet for his opinions on current affairs. It should be remembered, of course, that even by this stage, his heroic status by no means ensured that he would always be treated respectfully by the press. During the general election of 1951, for example, the Daily Mirror famously sought to portray him as a warmonger. Now I want to move to the question of technology, image, and style, and how those things relate. I want to consider how Churchill's image, and indeed his literary style, was shaped by the media technology of his age. I want to suggest, firstly, that his early journalism was influenced by the means that he had at his disposal to convey his writings home. Technology, though, did not determine everything. It intersected with geography and with economics. Consider his first Cuban adventure in 1895, when he spent a fortnight in the field with Spanish forces who were fighting against indigenous rebels. Now, Churchill had access to the telegraph at the time when he was in Havana, and he used it for personal and financial communications. And it won't be a surprise to those of you who are familiar with his habits to learn that he asked his mother to lend him some money via telegram. Yet he didn't send his articles in that way. He was not yet a celebrated correspondent, and the expense of doing so would have been prohibitive. By 6th of December 1895, by which time he was back out of the field, back in Havana, he had written 4 of the 5 articles that he wrote, and he completed the last when he got back to Tampa Bay. Now, these articles must have been sent to England by sea, and even that was actually quite quick. So the first was published on 13th of December 1895, just a little less than a week after he'd sent it. And that was 2 days before Churchill boarded his boat home to Britain, back from New York. However, although, as I say, the first of these was published on 13th of December, the last of these articles didn't appear until 13th of January. Now, what this tells us, I think, is that these letters, as they were described, were not intended either by Churchill or by the editor to be seen as up-to-the-minute news. Rather, these were a more reflective feature-style journalism, which was to be spread out across a series of weeks. And it was a similar picture when Churchill reported from the northwest frontier of India 2 years later. His first letter from Malakand was written on 3rd of September 1897, but it didn't appear in the Daily Telegraph until 6th of October. Similarly, when he wrote from the Sudan in 1898, there was a 3 or 4 week delay between writing and publication, and the articles were routed via Churchill's mother, which suggests that urgency wasn't the absolutely uppermost thing in his mind. During the Boer War, Churchill did send news telegrams, as I mentioned earlier, but he also sent more descriptive and impressionistic letters, which again took a few weeks to be published from their original composition. So journalism at this time was, if you like, a 2-speed or even a multi-speed process, and different forms of communication seemed to demand different kinds of writing. And so, in the case of his letters from the Sudan, we can see very clearly how Churchill intended to write in a manner which seems quite unlike modern journalism, and indeed even pretended not to be journalism. His idea, which may seem rather strange, was that the articles would be published anonymously in the first instance, and they would be presented as though the author had written them as letters to a friend, which the friend had then decided to publish without the author's knowledge. This was an effort to emulate the 18th century writer and politician Joseph Addison. Churchill's idea was that the Morning Post would be complicit in this idea, and all was to be revealed when the series finished. As Churchill explained to the Post's editor, Oliver Borthwick, the style is essentially literary, and the farcical manner in which they are presented to the public will add, I think, to the interest and amusement with which they will be read. I shall keep up the illusion to the very end, and in about 3 weeks I will write and bitterly reproach my friend, in quotation marks, for his indiscretion. I shall arrange for my mother to let the secret out gradually through the other newspapers. You must continue to wink your eye. Now, in fact, the Post didn't want to go along with this, and it edited the letters in such a way as to dispense with the ruse. Although, as he had planned, Churchill's authorship was only revealed at the end of the final article, the elaborate pretense that he was not writing for publication was discarded. And Churchill was annoyed, telling his mother, "This was a most amusing conceit, and from a literary point of view, added to the elegance of the letters. You should have insisted on my idea being used or the letters destroyed. As it is, the whole series will lose its peculiar idea and become mere banal penny-a-line journalism." Now, this episode may look rather odd to modern eyes, and presumably Borthwick, the editor, rejected Churchill's idea because he too found it strange, inappropriate, or just old-fashioned. But it does show us, I think, that Churchill was attempting to be playful and innovative in his writing. And in some ways, this marked him out as unusual amongst his war correspondent peers. At the time of the Boer War, the writer Richard Le Gallienne made a comparison between Churchill and G.W. Stevens, the man I mentioned earlier, the Daily Mail journalist, who had died of typhoid during the siege of Ladysmith. So Le Gallienne wrote, "Mr. Stevens was one of the cleverest reporters of war as a picnic, but he was not really a great war correspondent for that very reason. Behind a pen no less precisely graphic than Stevens, Churchill makes one conscious of a richness of temperament, or warmth and depth of feeling of which Stevens in his writing gave no hint. Mr. Churchill is gay and modern enough, but he is au fond deeply serious and has the gift, rare just now among our young writers, of being moved by moving things." So I would argue that late Victorian news culture allowed Churchill the space to conduct his literary experiments, even though, as we've seen, editors didn't simply give him carte blanche. His journalism during this period shows remarkable skill and thoughtfulness mixed with an extraordinary self-consciousness that sometimes crossed into bumptiousness. Perhaps it was that very combination that made it so appealing. Let's turn briefly from words to pictures. If technology influenced Churchill's style, then it also influenced his media image. The question of how he was portrayed, of course, was something over which he had relatively little direct control. At the time of the Boer War, the advent of cheap portable cameras increased the possibilities of exciting war photography. There are several good examples of candid photos of Churchill at this period, including some of Churchill after his capture by the Boers, and then after his escape when he got back to Durban. Yet at this time there was no means for photographs to be conveyed telegraphically, and so there was necessarily a delay before these pictures could be published at home in Britain. And accordingly, some of the most dramatic episodes in Churchill's career were portrayed to the British people in the form of sketches drawn by people, we have to assume, in London, who had never been anywhere near the scenes and the locations that they were actually portraying. And I give you a good example of this in your excellent museum downstairs. If you go and look for the panel, which is a page from the Illustrated London News, which is headlined "The Escape of Brave Winston Churchill from Pretoria," essentially a cartoon book style telling of this story. It's very, very typical of how news stories were often told at this time. And so the Illustrated London News actually persisted in this for a surprisingly long time. And so events such as Churchill's 1908 Manchester by-election fight, where photos could well have been available, they could have been used, were again portrayed via drawings, via sketches. And the Illustrated London News only published its first action shot of Churchill, if you will, as opposed to a portrait, showing him as a passenger as a plane as late as 1914, although the technology that allowed it to do so had existed well before. And so photos and drawings for a long time continued to coexist side by side in the press. And so, again, it wasn't technology alone that determined the means by which images were presented. Things varied from publication to publication, and editorial judgment, public taste, and also various forms of regulation influenced the types of pictures that appeared in print. Now, one very obvious form in which drawing persists, in which non-photographic images of Churchill persist in the press, were those of editorial cartoons. And this was a genre in which Churchill himself took a great deal of interest. "I've always loved cartoons," he wrote in an interwar essay on the subject. "At my private school at Brighton, there were 3 or 4 volumes of cartoons from Punch, and on Sundays we were allowed to study them. This was a very good way of learning history, or at any rate of learning something. But," he asked himself, "how would they like to be cartooned themselves? Fancy having that process going on every week, often every day, over the whole of your life, and all your fellow countrymen and friends and family seeing you thus held up to mockery and shame. But," Churchill confessed, "it is not so bad as you would expect. Just as eels are supposed to get used to skinning, so politicians get used to being caricatured. In fact, by a strange trait in human nature, they even get to like it. They even had a tendency," he wrote, "to get offended and downcast when the treatment stopped." Churchill's delightful essay reminds us that the popular image of him today, mainly derived from the 1930s and after, is in important respects different from that which obtained earlier in his career. Now, obviously, this is in part because he changed physically and because of changes in male fashion, such as the slow decline in popularity of the top hat. But the whims of the cartoonists also played a role. We now associate Churchill with cigars, and yet the first cartoon I can find him that shows him smoking one dates from 1925, although there were earlier press photographs showing him with a cigar. Earlier in his career, before the 1920s, the trademark which cartoons used to identify him was a very small hat. And according to Churchill, the legend of my hats dated from 1910, when during one of the general elections of that year, he went for a walk with his wife Clementine and unthinkingly put on a very tiny felt hat that had been packed with his luggage. As we came back from our walk, there was the photographer, and he took a picture. Ever since, the cartoonists and paragraphists have dwelt on my hats, how many there are, how strange and queer, and how I am always changing them, and what importance I attach to them, and so on. It is all rubbish, and it is all founded upon a single photograph. Now again, if you look downstairs at the museum, you'll see that there are a number of cartoons, at least 2 cartoons, which again do make specific reference to the topic of Churchill's hats. Now, Churchill, when he said that this story was all complete rubbish, was possibly being a little bit disingenuous. As we have seen, the press had taken an interest in his hats during the 1906 election, and it may well be that Churchill had seen that this could be advantageous. As the cartoonist David Lowe recalled, Winston Churchill deliberately advertised himself in his early political days by wearing a succession of unusual hats, and in later years by always carrying an outsized cigar, foibles which were eagerly used and improved upon by the cartoonists with his open encouragement. The early Churchill wore normal hats when the photographers were not around, and in his later years it was noticeable to keen eyes that his public cigars were smoked never more than about 1 inch. Now, in fact, Churchill's essay, perhaps he was giving a bit of a wink to the reader and hinted that the legend of his hats was actually helpful to his image. Well, if it is a help to these worthy gentlemen in their hard work, why should I complain, he asked. Indeed, I think I will convert the legend into reality by buying myself a new hat on purpose. The third theme I'd like to address is the question of control and influence and the degree to which officialdom, or Churchill himself, was able to affect how the media covered him. Now, Churchill clearly could never fully control how the media portrayed him, but he was astute at making the best he could of the opportunities that came his way. So I want to look in detail at the question of how effective he was at suppressing unwelcome stories and promoting positive ones, and what tools he had at his disposal in order to do so. Now, this, of course, varied a great deal across his career, depending partly on whether he was in power with official machinery at his disposal. And again, too, we need to understand the changing character and culture of the media during the period in which he was journalistically and politically active. It should be remembered to begin with that when the young Churchill fought in what he later called jolly little wars against barbarous peoples, he was acting simultaneously as a soldier and a journalist. To put it another way, he was the ultimate embedded correspondent, writing about conflicts in which he himself was actually fighting. At the time, this type of dual role was by no means uncommon, but it didn't necessarily make for objective journalism. When he was with the Malacan Field Force, he saw some things done by the British forces which he admitted to be horrifying, such as the effects on the human body of the expanding dum-dum bullets used by the British. He wrote to his grandmother, "The picture is a terrible one, and naturally it has a side to which one does not allude in print." Even so, even if Churchill was reticent on some such points, it must be said that his writing did annoy many in the military, not least Kitchener, who did his best to prevent Churchill from joining the Sudan campaign. He failed, of course, and then came on the receiving end of Churchill's censure himself for ordering the destruction of the Mahdi's tomb after the Battle of Omdurman, although it might be noted that Churchill had actually left the army by the point that these criticisms were published. I would argue that Churchill pushed the limits of the sayable, but he never definitively breached them. It is fair to say that Churchill was as outspoken as his position allowed, yet arguably what annoyed people was less what he said than his presumption as a junior officer in saying it. His first book is said to have been nicknamed A Subaltern's Advice to Generals. Once he entered politics, Churchill's situation changed as increasingly he became the object or the subject of press commentary. This leads us to ask, how deferential was the press towards politicians at this time? In other words, to what extent did it refrain from publishing negative or embarrassing material about powerful people simply because they were well-connected, socially independent, socially superior authority figures? Now, we might well assume that the Victorian Edwardian press was, by today's standards, extremely tame. And it's certainly true that when it came to matters of politicians' private lives, it was very reticent, and that when a paper overstepped the mark, the law of libel was often applied really in the interest of the powerful rather than in the interest of the truth. And this allowed Churchill's colleague David Lloyd George to get away with, not only to get away with serial adultery, but for this news to be suppressed, although journalists did know about it. Now, Churchill himself resorted to libel law fairly often, and very often, indeed justifiably, to correctly challenge claims that were undoubtedly false. On one occasion, though, as Celia Sands has shown in her book, Churchill did attempt to browbeat Aylmer Haldane, who had been one of his fellow prisoners in South Africa, into giving testimony favourable to him in an action against Blackwood's magazine, which had Blackwood's had criticised Churchill's actions during his escape. Now, as it turned out, the magazine failed to stand its ground, and so Churchill won by default. Yet the very fact that inaccurate or doubtful claims made it into print in the first place suggests that the press was by no means utterly docile. Politicians did not necessarily get an easy ride from the pre-1914 press, which could be trenchant and incisive and often showed a splendid capacity for sarcasm and invective. When Lloyd George and Churchill, as ministers in Asquith's Liberal government, fell out in 1914 over the question of naval spending, the papers fell over themselves in their eagerness to expose the split, essentially simply drawing attention to discrepancies in their public statements, but doing so very effectively. And during this affair, we might also note Churchill acted behind the scenes to try and get favourable coverage for his point of view. And at his behest, Admiralty officials briefed a friendly Liberal MP, Leo Chotzer-Money, with figures that he could use in press articles to help boost the case for greater naval spending. Now, Churchill, of course, was hardly the first politician to attempt to influence or manipulate the press. One of the ways in which he, in common with many others, tried to exercise his sway was through his personal connections with editors and proprietors. For example, in 1913, he approached Lord Northcliffe about the Marconi affair, which was an insider trading scandal in which Lloyd George and other Liberal ministers, although not, it should be emphasised, Churchill himself, were caught up. Churchill asked Northcliffe to treat the Marconi matter on non-party lines and assured him that there was not much real meat in it. Northcliffe agreed to do so, to play it down, and subsequently warned Churchill that your Marconi friends, as he put it, were mishandling the press. Now, Churchill's relationship with Northcliffe was never a truly easy one. His friendship with Lord Beaverbrook, by contrast, owner of the Daily Express, was much more genuine. But that's not to say that Beaverbrook always gave Churchill the coverage he wanted. During Churchill's campaign against reform in India during the 1930s, he got support from the Daily Mail, which was now under the control of Northcliffe's brother, Lord Rothermere, and also from the Morning Post, which by this stage was very much on its last legs. But Beaverbrook's papers did not back Churchill over India. Beaverbrook, too, became a minister for much of the World War II period, and some even thought that he was plotting to become Prime Minister himself. And the friendship with Beaverbrook was in some ways politically damaging to Churchill because Beaverbrook was seen as a malevolent crony. In 1945, he was widely but wrongly credited with the authorship of Churchill's notorious 1945 election broadcast, in which he warned that if Labour were elected, it would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo. Equally, the Beaverbrook press had been unhelpful during Churchill's campaign against appeasement in the 1930s, in that it was hardly unique. Richard Cockett has shown how Neville Chamberlain's government exerted considerable efforts to muzzle the press, and to a great extent achieved this with the willing connivance of journalists, editors, and newspaper proprietors. Meanwhile, ministers pressured the BBC to prevent Churchill and other independent voices broadcasting on foreign policy. Of course, this was very bad news for Churchill at the time. Yet when he became Prime Minister, it was not to his disadvantage that the media establishment was in many ways rather pliable and easy to control. Now, of course, his government in the midst of a world war had a much better excuse than Chamberlain's for its efforts to rein in the press. In this situation, during World War II, the media were often reliant on official propaganda, which was frequently clumsy. During the Battle of Britain, the Air Ministry's communiques, full of circumlocution, cliches, interjections, and padding, had to be read out in full by BBC announcers, and it was extraordinarily difficult also for newsreel crews to access RAF bases. However, although Churchill was not too fussy about ensuring that British claims about the levels of German losses in the battle were strictly accurate, he did not in general attempt to hold back unwelcome information from the British people. A major exception, and I do emphasise that it was an exception, was his suppression of the news of the sinking of the liner Lancastria with the loss of over 3,000 lives in June 1940, which he thought would be bad for morale at what was a particularly trying time. Now, Churchill, it must be said, would not have agreed in any way with the proposition that he was dealing with a supine press that was easily susceptible to government bidding. In the autumn of 1940, he was criticised by the Daily Mirror and the Sunday Pictorial, which suggested that the paralysing influence of Neville Chamberlain lived on in his government, in Churchill's own government, even now that Chamberlain himself had retired from the War Cabinet. An endeavour was being made to poison relations between members of the government, the Prime Minister fumed. It was intolerable that those bearing the burden of supreme responsibility at this time should be subject to attacks of this kind. Churchill famously was particularly angered by a 1942 cartoon in the Daily Mirror by Philip Zeck, which showed a merchant seaman clinging to a raft after his ship had been torpedoed. The caption read, "The price of petrol has been increased by 1 penny, official." Zeck's intention was to show that bringing fuel to Britain in wartime was a highly dangerous business. Therefore, people should be careful not to waste it. Churchill, however, read the cartoon as an accusation that men's lives were being thrown away in the interests of oil company profits. The Mirror, the paper which had published the cartoon, narrowly escaped the fate of the Communist Daily Worker, which was shut down by the government during 1941 and 1942. And perhaps it was the Daily Worker, indeed, that Stalin had in mind when he discussed Anglo-American plans for the invasion of North Africa with Churchill when they met at the Kremlin in August 1942. I quote to you from the official record of the meeting. Mr. Stalin hoped that nothing about the plans for Operation Torch would appear in the British press. The Prime Minister replied that he wished he could control the British press as Mr. Stalin controlled the Soviet press. Mr. Stalin said that Mr. Churchill had quite enough powers to exercise control whenever he wished to. Now, at a certain level, that was true insofar as Churchill had been able to suppress the Daily Worker. However, what Churchill couldn't do, and in spite of his occasional and I think understandable overreactions, essentially did not wish to do, was to suppress free speech. At the 1945 election, of course, the vociferous criticism which he faced, which he had received in the Mirror and elsewhere, played a significant part in his electoral defeat. Now, as we have already seen, Churchill continued to get a rough ride from some parts of the press for as long as he remained politically active. It was only with his retirement and death that greater unanimity about his reputation became possible as political controversy faded into the past. However, during one important episode, the media did him an enormous favour. In June 1953, he suffered a very serious stroke. I'm going to quote to you from the recollections of his private secretary, Jock Colville. I'm going to quote at length. 2 days after his stroke, Churchill, gave me strict orders not to let it be known that he was temporarily incapacitated and to ensure that the administration continued to function as if he were in full control. I could not obey Churchill's injunction to tell nobody. The truth would undoubtedly leak to the press unless I took immediate defensive action. So I wrote urgently and in manuscript to 3 particular friends of Churchill, Lords Camrose, owner of the Daily Telegraph, Beaverbrook and Bracken, and sent the letters to London by dispatch rider. All 3 immediately came to Chartwell and paced the lawn in earnest conversation. They achieved the all but incredible and in peacetime possibly unique success of gagging Fleet Street, something they would have done for nobody but Churchill. Not a word of the Prime Minister's stroke was published until he casually mentioned it in a speech in the House of Commons a year later. Had it not been for Colville's prompt action and for the willing collusion of the press, Churchill's tenure in Downing Street could well have been brought to an abrupt end. I now want to move to my conclusion. Churchill spent his early life seeking out celebrity, yet to a great extent as well, celebrity was thrust upon him. Of course, his global fame owed an enormous amount to his achievements and to the unique historical circumstances in which he was operating. But the way in which his reputation spread was in part a product of the media revolution which I have described to you today. I have suggested in this lecture that if we want to understand Churchill, we need to understand the media culture with which he sometimes struggled, but in which he ultimately thrived. Let us ask then, was this in fact a journalistic golden age? There are many reasons that we might answer no. There was nepotism, corruption, and cronyism in the press. In the search for circulation, the press often played fast and loose with the facts and made spurious allegations. At the same time, authority and social power often went unscrutinized and unchallenged. Yet it is also possible to look at the journalism of the Churchill era in a much more positive way. This was a thrilling time of enormous possibilities and huge innovation. It was a period of excitement, glamour, astonishing technical accomplishments, a time of shallow stunts, yes, but also one of dedicated truth-seeking and passionate crusades. For both good and ill, this was when mass communication came of age, with irreversible consequences for the practice of politics. So, the opportunities that the age offered Churchill were indeed golden, and he seized them by the throat. If journalism was for him simply the means to an end, he nonetheless excelled at it, and in some ways he beat the professionals at their own game. If his treatment by the press was sometimes bruising, this was the inevitable counterpart of the huge benefits he extracted from the media. Churchill would surely have had a political career in any age, but it was only the late 19th and 20th century media that made possible the type of political career that Churchill wanted to have. It was obviously a career of great substance, but it was also a career of great showmanship. and a great showman requires a great audience. In the end, as he famously said about himself in relation to alcohol, Winston Churchill took more out of journalism than journalism took out of him. Thank you very much.
The Association of Churchill Fellows of Westminster College was created in 1969 at the time of the dedication of the Churchill Memorial. It is a honorary society of individuals who have demonstrated their extraordinary concern for the National Churchill Museum and their interest in its future development and utilization. Through its Board of Governors, the association serves in an advisory capacity to the President and the Board of Trustees of Westminster College in matters relating to the operation, support, and overall management of this unique national historic resource. Membership is for life. This afternoon, we are privileged to induct 3 new members whose interest in the National Churchill Museum and whose unstinting support has qualified them for this special recognition. Randy and Rebecca Pierce could not join us today, but they received their certificates and medallions 2 weeks ago here in the church before the Winston Churchill speech competition. Their contribution to that competition are noted in your program. Will Richard Toye please come forward to receive his medallion of office and membership certificate? Professor Toye, the Board of Governors of the Association of Churchill Fellows has recommended for your membership in the association. The Board of Trustees of Westminster College has affirmed that recommendation. Therefore, we are delighted to welcome you in the Association of Churchill Fellows. We recognize you and thank you for your dedication and commitment on the ongoing welfare of the museum. All of us who are associated with the National Churchill Museum are indebted to you for the lecture you just presented, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the years to come on behalf of this worthy cause.
Well, I know how much you have enjoyed Dr. Toye's lecture, and before we have an opportunity to visit with him at the reception in the Undercroft, I have an important announcement to make that is going to greatly impact the future of the National Churchill Museum. Thanks to the generosity of Dr. Monroe E. and Sandra L. Trout of Appleton, Wisconsin, a very significant gift has been bestowed upon the college to establish the Sandra L. and Monroe E. Trout Professorship of Churchill Studies. Dr. Trout has been a major force in the healthcare industry for over 40 years, serving on the boards and creative teams of 8 different industries. He earned his undergraduate and medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania and holds a degree of law from Dickinson Law School. In 1995, he was accepted into the Horatio Alger Association of Distinguished Americans. His wife, Sandra, is a native of Appleton, Wisconsin, where they now make their home, and attended the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They have a love for Churchill and all things Churchillian, and they, along with us, want to see the life and legacy of Sir Winston Churchill carried on for future generations. And while they were certainly impressed with the church and the quality of the exhibits in the museum, both of them envisioned the possibilities of our museum being elevated on the national and international stage, a dream that we share at Westminster College. Their significant gift, announced today, will move us closer to that direction. Dr. Trout, the Trout Endowed Professor of Churchill Studies, has first allowed us to bring to our campus and to the National Churchill Museum someone of Dr. Jim Williams' academic stature to guide the future of the museum. Having a dedicated scholar of Jim's caliber, coupled with these new resources, will help us raise the profile of the National Churchill Museum. Resources are now available to fund professional development opportunities for the museum's director, providing Jim with the means to research and publish in the most prestigious scholarly journals and present at the most prominent Churchill events in the world. The Trouts are particularly interested in seeing that some of the top traveling exhibits come to the museum, and the Trout Endowment will make that possible as well. On behalf of Westminster College and the National Churchill Museum, I want to publicly thank Monroe and Sandy Trout for their extraordinary generosity. We regret that they could not be with us today for today's lecture, but we're videotaping this lecture and this presentation, and we hope that the videotape will express our deep appreciation for their generosity. Exciting times lie ahead for the museum as this remarkable testament to the life and achievements of Churchill on our campus continues to grow in stature and public acclaim due to the Trout Endowment. Churchill himself used to say his tastes were very simple. He was easily satisfied with the very best. In keeping with the Churchill traditions of this college, we at Westminster share this sentiment, and thanks to the work and support of people like Monroe and Sandy Trout, our National Churchill Museum will continue to be the very best. Before I turn the lectern over to Dr. Williams for the close of our program, I'd like to ask that he come forward so that I can present him with this certificate establishing the Sandra L. and Monroe E. Trout Professorship in Churchill Studies. Jim, congratulations. The floor is yours. Congratulations.
I heard about a certificate, but this is the nicest certificate I've ever received, so thank you very much. It is an honor to return to the college. For those of you who don't know, I graduated from Westminster in 1986, was a history major here, and not by coincidence, I wrote my senior thesis, which all history majors are still required to do, I think. It was a history of this memorial project in the 1960s. I've been very fortunate since then to know most of the people who were still living in the 80s and had been involved in the project to bring the Church of St. Mary the Virgin Aldermanbury to Fulton and the campus here. I'm very fortunate to come back, and I'm very excited to be the executive director and the Trout professor. And I think together with all of our wonderful supporters, including all of you, we have a great future ahead of us. I will remind you that a year from now will be the 70th anniversary of the Iron Curtain speech up in the gymnasium in 1946. And we have planning ahead of us for that event, which we hope will attract world leaders again, as we've managed in the past 70 years to attract to the college. Looking forward to that, looking forward to our painting exhibit at Washington University in St. Louis this fall. And I'm looking forward to just having a wonderful experience back here in Fulton and Westminster. A little impromptu addition to our program. If you were at brunch, you heard the winning speech from our Winston Churchill speech competition this year. It's a middle school program that we've been running now for 2 years, and it was very exciting to, in my first 3 months, to have a visit from the British ambassador 1 week, and a few weeks later to have middle school students here at this very podium in the church giving really remarkable speeches using Winston Churchill as their guide. I think it gives us all hope in the future that students like Brenda Jones, our winner, are out there and they are using Churchill and his wisdom in their lives. And we hope that more of them will participate in the future and that some of them will come to Westminster College and carry on our Churchill tradition. The contest is, is held in conjunction with, in cooperation with, the Education Department at Blenheim Palace, which you heard earlier is the birthplace of Sir Winston Churchill. And the Duke of Marlborough, who still lives at Blenheim Palace, and his staff is kind enough to provide us with this shield, as they call it, made from wood from the Blenheim estates. And I'd like to present this again. She received it 2 weeks ago. We took it back from her, so we could show her off again to you all today. Brenna Jones from Herman, Missouri. Her parents and brother are here today with us, and they're very proud, as we are of her. So thank you again for coming, and I really appreciate the honor that the college, I can't think of better circumstances to come back to Westminster to have a professorship come with it. So thank you very much, Dr. Forsyth.
Please stand and join us in the singing of hymn 210 in your hymnals, Our God, Our Help in Ages Past, which was one of Churchill's favorites.
For
I declare this Kemper Lecture officially adjourned.